All right, and we're live. Let's try to finish uh, Kant's, uh, aspect of time and space, and then tomorrow, hopefully, we can go into the transcendental logic. Yesterday, I was supposed to read, but I did an impromptu live yesterday. That I'm pretty sure some of you saw. But, anyways, let's get into it. The general remarks on the transcendental aesthetic. And here Kant will, give a more elaborate or kind of elaborate conclusion maybe, on what people might say about what he's saying. All right, let's begin. It will first be necessary to explain as distinctly as possible our opinion in regard to the fundamental constitution of sensible cognition in general, in order to preclude all misinterpretation of it. We have therefore wanted to say that all our intuition is nothing but the representation of appearance. So I actually like this sentence, so I'm going to highlight that. We have therefore wanted to say that all our intuition is nothing but the representation of appearance. That the things that we intuit are not in themselves what we intuit them to be, nor are their relations so constituted in themselves as they appear to us, and that if we remove our own subject, or even only the subjective constitution of the senses in general, then all relations of objects in space and time, indeed space and time themselves, would disappear, and as appearances they cannot exist in themselves but only in us. What may be the case with objects in themselves and abstracted from all this receptivity of our sensibility remains entirely unknown to us. We are acquainted with nothing except our way of perceiving them, which is peculiar to us and which therefore does not necessarily pertain to every being. Pertain to every being, though to be sure it pertains to every human being. We are concerned solely with this. Space and time are its pure forms, sensation in general its matter. We can cognize only the former a priori, that is to say, prior to all actual perception, and they are therefore called pure intuition. So I'm also going to highlight this. The latter, however, is that in our cognition that is responsible for it being called a posteriori cognition, that's to say, empirical intuition. The former adheres to our sensibility absolutely, necessarily. Whatever sort of sensations we may have, the latter can be very different. Even if we could bring this intuition of ours to the highest degree of distinctness, we would not thereby come any closer to the constitution of objects in themselves. For in any case, we would still completely cognize only our own way of intuiting. That is to say, our sensibility. And this always only under the conditions originally depending on the subject, space and time, what the objects may be in themselves. Hold on, I lost my place all of a sudden. Even if we could bring this intuition of ours to the highest degree of distinctness, we would not thereby come any closer to the constitution of objects in themselves. For in any case, we would still completely cognize only our own way of intuiting, that is to say, our sensibility, and this always only under conditions originally depending on the subject, space, and time. What the objects may be in themselves would still never be known through the most enlightened cognition of their appearance, which alone is given to us. That our entire sensibility is nothing but the confused representation of things, which contains solely that which pertains to them in themselves, but only under a heap of marks and partial representations that we can never consciously separate from one another, is therefore a falsification of the concept of sensibility and of appearance that renders the entire theory of them useless and empty. The difference between an indistinct and a distinct representation is merely logical and does not concern the content. Highlight that. Without doubt, the concept of right that is used by the healthy understanding contains the very same things that the most subtle speculation can evolve out of it. Only in common and practical use one is not conscious of these manifold representations in these thoughts. Thus, one cannot say that the common concept is sensible and contains a mere appearance, for right cannot appear at all. Rather, its concept lies in the understanding and represents a constitution, the moral constitution of actions that pertain to them in themselves. The representation of a body in intuition, on the contrary, contains nothing at all that could pertain to an object in itself, but merely the appearance of something and the way in which we are affected by it. And this receptivity of our cognitive capacity is called sensibility and remains worlds apart from the cognition of the object in itself, even if one might see through to the very bottom of it, the appearance. The Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy has therefore directed all investigations of the nature. So immediately, actually, Kant is already pointing that there is a massive gap between our sensibility and the cognition of the object in itself. It's a massive gap. Like right here, he says, and remains worlds apart from the cognition of the object in itself, even if one might see through the very bottom of it of appearance. Okay. The Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy has therefore directed all investigations of the nature and origin of our cognitions to an entirely unjust point of view in considering the distinction between sensibility and the intellectual as merely logical. Since it is obviously transcendental and does not concern merely the form of distinctness or indistinctness, but its origin and content, so that through sensibility we do not cognize the constitution of things in themselves merely indistinctly, but rather not at all. And as soon as we take away our subjective constitution, the represented object, with the properties that sensible intuition attributes to it, is nowhere to be encountered, nor can it be encountered. For it is just this subjective constitution that determines its form as appearance. We ordinarily distinguish quite well between that which is essentially attached to the intuition of appearances and is valid for every human being, every human sense in general, and that which pertains to them only contingently because it is not valid for the relation of sensibility in general, but only for a particular situation or organization of this or that sense. And thus, one calls the first cognition one that represents the object in itself, but the second one only its appearance. This distinction, however, is only empirical. If one stands by it, as commonly happens, and does not regard that empirical intuition as in turn mere appearance, as ought to happen, so that there is nothing to be encountered in it that pertains to anything in itself, then our transcendental distinction is lost, and we believe ourselves to cognize things in themselves, though we have nothing to do with anything except appearances anywhere in the world of sense, even in the deepest research into its objects. Thus, we would certainly call a rainbow a mere appearance in a sun shower, but would call this rain the thing in itself, and this is correct as long as we understand the latter concept in a merely physical sense, as that which is universal experience, and all different positions relative to the senses is always determined thus and not otherwise in intuition. But if we consider this imperial object in general, and without turning to its agreement with every human sense, ask whether it, not the raindrops, since these as appearances are already empirical objects, represents an object in itself, then the question of the relation of the representation to the object is transcendental. And not only these drops are mere appearances, but even their round form. Indeed, even the space through which they fall are nothing in themselves, but only mere modifications or foundations of our sensible intuition. The transcendental object, however, remains unknown to us. The second important concern of our transcendental aesthetic is that it not merely earns some favor as a plausible hypothesis, but that it be as certain and indubitable as can ever be demanded of a theory that is to serve as an organon. In order to make this certainty fully convincing, we will choose a case in which its validity can become obvious and that can serve to make that which has been adduced and even in section 3 even more clear. Thus, if it were to be supposed that space and time are in themselves objective and conditions of the possibility of things in themselves, then it would be shown first that there is a large number of a priori apodictic and synthetic propositions about both, but especially about space, which we will therefore here investigate as our primary example. Since the propositions of geometry are cognized synthetically a priori and with apodictic certainty, I ask, whence do you take such propositions? And on what does our understanding rely in attaining to such absolutely necessary and universally valid truths? There is no other way than through concepts or through intuitions, both of which, however, are given as such either a priori or a posteriori. The latter, namely empirical concepts, together with that on which they are grounded, empirical intuition, cannot yield any synthetic proposition except one that is also merely empirical, that is to say, a proposition of experience. Thus, it can never contain necessity and absolute universality. So, this is his beef against experience. Kant's beef against experience itself. Thus, it can never contain necessity and absolute universality of the sort that is nevertheless characteristics of all propositions of geometry. Concerning the first, and only means for attaining such cognitions, however, namely through mere concepts or a priori intuitions, it is clear that from mere concepts no synthetic cognition but only merely uh, analytic cognition can be attained. Take the proposition that with two straight lines, no space at all can be enclosed, thus no figure is possible, and try to derive it from the concept of straight lines and the number 2. Or take the proposition that a figure is possible with three straight lines, and in the same way try to derive it from these concepts. All of your effort is in vain, and you see yourself forced to take refuge in intuition, as indeed geometry always does. You thus give yourself an object in intuition. But what kind is this? Is it a pure a priori intuition or an empirical one? Okay. If it were the latter, then no universally valid, let alone apodictic proposition could ever come from it, for experience can never provide anything of this sort. You must therefore give your object a priori, in intuition and ground your synthetic proposition on this. If there did not lie in you a faculty for intuiting a priori, if this subjective condition regarding form were not at the same time the universal a priori condition in which alone the object of this outer intuition is itself possible, if the object, the triangle, were something in itself without relation to your subject, then how could you say that what necessarily lies uh, in your subjective conditions for constructing a triangle must also necessarily pertain to the triangle in itself? For you could not add to your concept of three lines something new, the figure that must thereby necessarily be encountered in the object. Since this is given prior to your cognition and not through it, if therefore space and time as well were not a mere form, where is it? Sorry, I lost my position here. If therefore space and time as well were not a mere form of your intuition that contains a priori conditions under which alone things could be outer objects for you, which are nothing in themselves without these subjective conditions, then you could make out absolutely nothing synthetic and a priori about outer objects. I like this line for some reason. It is therefore indubitably certain, and not merely possible or even probable that space and time, as the necessary conditions of all outer and inner experience, are merely subjective conditions. Oh snap, I messed up. Are merely subjective conditions of our intuition, in relation to which therefore all objects are mere appearances and not things given for themselves in this way. About these appearances, further, much may be said a priori that concerns their form, but nothing whatsoever about the things in themselves that may ground them. For confirmation of this theory of ideality of outer as well as inner sense, thus of all objects of the senses as mere appearances, this comment is especially useful, that everything in our cognition that belongs to intuition, with the exception therefore of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure and the will, which are not cognitions at all, contains nothing but mere relations of places in one intuition, extension, alteration of places, motion, and laws in accordance with which this alteration is determined, moving forces. But what is present in the place, or what it produces in the things themselves, besides the alteration of place, is not given through these relations. Now, through mere relations, no thing in itself is cognized. It is therefore right to judge that since nothing is given to us through outer sense except mere representations of relation, outer sense can also contain in its representation only the relation of an object to the subject, and not that which is internal to this object in itself. I'm going to highlight that. So he's saying that our outer sense can only contain its representation only can also contain in its representation only the relation of an object to the subject and not that which is internal to the object itself. So we can only understand the object through the relation to us, but not in the object inside of itself. It is exactly the same in the case of inner sense. It is not merely that the representations of outer sense make up the proper material with which we occupy our mind, but also the time in which we place these representations, which itself precedes the consciousness of them in experience and grounds the way in which we place them in mind as well as formal condition. We place them in mind as a formal condition, already contains relations of succession, of simultaneity, and of that which is simultaneous with succession, of that which persists. Now that which, as representation, can precede any act of thinking. Now that which, as representation, can precede. I'm going to highlight that, actually, because that's interesting. That's an interesting line, I feel like. I'm going to highlight all that. Okay. Now that which, as representation, can precede any act of thinking, something is intuition. And if it contains nothing but relations, it is the form of intuition which, since it does not represent anything except insofar as something is posited in the mind, can be nothing other than the way in which the mind is affected by its own activity, namely this positing of its representation. Thus the way it is affected through itself, that is to say, it is an inner sense as far as regards its form. Everything that is represented through a sense is to that extent always appearance, and an inner sense must therefore either not be admitted at all, or else the subject, which is the object of this sense, can only be represented by its means as appearance, not as it would judge of itself if its intuition were mere self-activity, that is to say, intellectual. So everything that is represented through a sense is to that extent always appearance. Interesting. Any difficulty in this depends merely on the question how a subject can internally intuit itself, yet this difficulty is common to every theory. Consciousness of itself, apperception, is the simple representation of the I, and if all of the manifold in the subject were given self-actively, through that alone, then the inner intuition would be intellectual. In human beings, this consciousness requires inner perception of the manifold that is antecedently given in the subject, and the manner in which this is given in the mind without spontaneity must be called sensibility on account of this difference. If the faculty for becoming conscious of oneself is to seek out, apprehend that which lies in the mind, it must affect the latter, and it can only produce an intuition of itself in such a way, whose form, however, which antecedently grounds it in the mind, determines the way in which the manifold is together in the mind. In the representation of time, there it then intuits itself not as it would immediately self-actively represent itself, but in accordance with the way in which it is affected from within, consequently as it appears to itself, not as it is. Okay, 3. If I say in space and time, intuition represents both outer objects as well as the self-intuition of the mind, as each affects our senses, that is to say, as it appears, that is not to say that these objects would be mere illusions, for in the appearance the objects, indeed even properties, that we attribute to them are always regarded as something really given, only insofar as this property depends only on the kind of intuition of the subject in the relation of the given object to it, then this object as appearance is to be distinguished from itself as object in itself. Thus, I do not say that bodies merely seem to exist outside me, or that my soul only seems to be given if I assert that the quality of space and time, in accordance with which, as condition of their existence, I posit both of these lies in my kind of intuition and not in these objects in themselves. It would be my own fault if I made that which I should count. It would be my own fault if I made that which I should count as appearance into mere illusion. So he's making this very strong distinction between mere appearance and illusion, which I really like, because I think a lot of people would head there quickly. If you're saying it's all appearance, then you're saying it's illusion, so on, so on. I'm trying to see how much longer we got. We don't got that much long. Okay, cool. We're almost done. But this does not happen according to. I will read. Actually, I will read this asterisk part because I feel like it's important. The predicates of appearance cannot be attributed to the object in itself in relation to our senses, for example, the red color or fragrance to the rose. But the illusion can never be attributed to the object as predicate, precisely because that would be to attribute to the object for itself what pertains to it only in relation to the senses or in general to the subject. For example, the two handles that were originally attributed to Saturn. What is not to be encountered in the object in itself at all, but is always to be encountered in its relation to the subject and is inseparable from the representation of this object, is appearance. And thus, the predicates of space and time are rightly attributed to the objects of the senses as such, and there is no illusion in this. On the contrary, if I attribute the redness to the rose in itself, the handles to Saturn, or extension to all outer objects in themselves, without looking to a determinate relation of these objects to the subject and limiting my judgment to this, then illusion first arises. So here he really goes into it, and I really like his explanation of this actually. So I'm enjoying this explanation. I like it a lot. Okay, so now he's going, but this does not happen according to our principle of the ideality of all our sensible intuitions. Rather, if one ascribes an objective reality to those forms of representation, then one cannot avoid thereby transforming everything into mere illusion. For if one regards space and time as properties that, as far as their possibility is concerned, must be encountered in things in themselves, and reflects on the absurdities in which one then becomes entangled, because two infinite things that are neither substances nor anything really inhering in substances must nevertheless be something existing, indeed, a necessary condition of the existence of all things, which also remain even if all existing things are removed. Then one cannot blame the good Berkeley if he demotes bodies to mere illusion. Indeed, even our own existence, which would be made dependent in such a way on the self subsisting reality of a non entity such as time, would be transformed along with this into mere illusion, an absurdity of which no one has yet allowed himself to be guilty. In natural theology, where one conceives of an object that is not that is not only not an object of intuition for us, but cannot even be an object of sensible intuition for itself, one is careful to remove the conditions of time and space from all of its intuition. For all of its cognition must be intuition and not thinking, which is always proof of limitations. So let me see this again. So for all of its cognition must be intuition and not thinking, which is always proof of limitations. But with what right can one do if this one has antecedently made both of these into forms of things in themselves, and indeed ones that, as a priori conditions of the existence of things, would remain even if one removed the things themselves? For as conditions of all existence in general, they would also have to be conditions of the existence of God. If one will not make them into objective forms of all things, then no alternative remains but to make them into subjective forms of our kind of outer as well as inner intuition, which is called sensible, but it is not original. That is to say, one through which the existence of the object, that is to say, one through which the existence of the object of intuition is itself given, and that, so far as we can have insight, can only pertain to the original being. Rather, it is dependent on the existence of the object. Thus, it is possible only insofar as the representational capacity of the subject is affected through that. Um, it is also not necessary for us to limit the kind of intuition in space and time to the sensibility of human beings. It may well be that all finite thinking beings must necessarily agree with human beings in this regard. Though we cannot decide this, yet even given such universal validity, this kind of intuition would not cease to be sensibility, for the very reason that it is derived, not original. Thus, not intellectual intuition, which for the ground already adduced seems to pertain only to the original being, never to one that is dependent as regards both its existence and its intuition, which determines its existence in relations to given objects, although the last remark must be counted only as an illustration of our aesthetic theory and not as a ground of its proof. Conclusion of the Transcendental Aesthetic. Here we now have one of the required pieces for the solution of the general problem of transcendental philosophy. How are synthetic a priori positions possible, namely pure a priori intuitions, space and time, in which we want to go beyond the given concept in a priori judgment? We encounter that which is to be discovered a priori and synthetically connected with it, not in the concept, but in the intuition that corresponds to it. But on the ground, such a judgment never extends beyond the objects of the senses and can hold only for objects of possible experience. All right, so this is the question that Kant will leave us with. How are synthetic a priori positions possible um, for his transcendental philosophy? Um, and then tomorrow, I'm excited because we will be going into the idea of the transcendental logic. So yay. And yeah, that's it. I thought I don't know. I really, again, I always really enjoy reading Kant. It's just nice. Um, you know, it's just always interesting hearing these ideas and how he thinks about them. So yeah, uh, I'm trying not to say much about if I agree, if I disagree. It's more like I want to spend time reading Kant and just kind of just being enmeshed in his language. You know, so I feel like that's where I want to be. But anyways, thank you guys for being here, supporting me as I continue to read Kant. I think Cadell has inspired me to continue German idealism as such. I think maybe after the critique of Kant, I will go into the science of logic. I don't know, maybe. All right, and that will be the end. All right, guys, take care.